to Knitting 101. Here we are at your final lesson, and today we're going to talk about knitting patterns. As I said when we started, I am a knitting pattern designer, which means that I design garments or accessories, shawls, socks, hats, and then I write down a pattern to tell other knitters how to knit the same thing. So you can think of this kind of like a recipe. So you see a dish that looks delicious and you want to know how to make it, you find the recipe. This is the same thing. Knitting patterns are widely available. I will go over a couple of different places that you can find them. But before you start searching for them, you're really going to want to know how to read one. Knitting has a bit of its own language, as we've already talked about with cast on, bind off, knit, purl. There's a lot of vocabulary and terminology that you'll learn over time. But in order to make patterns more readable, not only are we using this specific terminology for knitting, we also use a lot of abbreviations. So there's a lot of information to go through in a pattern, not only the instructions, but the abbreviations, the information about what kind of yarn to use, what needles, things like that. So what I'm going to do is do a screen recording while I scroll through one of my knitting patterns with you and teach you how to read it. Okay, so today I am going to walk you through a knitting pattern and explain what the different parts of it are. Any knitting pattern that you buy should have three basic elements. Now they may be laid out in a different order, you'll find them on a different page, but they should all be there. And those are, one, the pattern information, which is what kind of yarn to use, what sizes are included in the pattern, needle size, things like that. Secondly, a list of abbreviations. A lot of abbreviations are used in knitting patterns to constrain their size, and as you become a more experienced knitter, you'll have most of them memorized, but there should still be a list there. And then lastly, of course, the instructions, which are going to explain how to make the thing, whatever it is. So what I'm going to show you today is one of my knitting patterns. It's a pattern for a sweater, which may seem a little overwhelming if you're a new knitter, but sweater patterns tend to have the most information and be the most complex. So it's better to start with, all the information at once and just walk you through it. So this pattern, as I said, is for a sweater. It is for a cardigan that I published earlier this year. So your pattern is probably going to start out with a photo, and you'll probably find a few more photos in there. Then you'll have the name of the pattern. Patterns aren't just called sweater or hat. They all have names. This sweater pattern is called Humo Amargo. My name, my business logo, nothing super important there. Next, your pattern is probably going to have some kind of what we call romance text. None of this is super important. It's generally kind of a description of the pattern, maybe something about the inspiration, a little background, but there's not really going to be a lot of essential information in here. It's just kind of trying to sell the pattern a bit. And then here we're going to have that first element that I talked about, the pattern information. Now, as I said, different designers might include this information in a different part of the pattern, on a different page, but it should be there. And you should also have access to this information before you buy a pattern, because you're going to want to know all of these details before you decide whether or not to knit whatever it may be. So we'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about where to find patterns, but you should be able to access this information somewhere before you make the pattern purchase. So sizes, this is generally speaking what you're going to find for garment patterns. Hats may come in 2 or 3 sizes, socks should have sizes, but things like shawls and scarves, probably not. So I want to go over a little bit about how the sizes are laid out, because this is going to be important for reading the pattern. So you'll see there's a first size, and then a series of additional sizes that may be delineated by parentheses like this or brackets. And what this means is that throughout the instructions, the first number, for example, the cast on number, the first one is going to correspond with the first size, and then as you move along, the second number is for the second size, and so forth. So you can see here, the smallest size, extra small, is a 34-inch bust. The small has a 38-inch bust, and so on. And what you may want to do is, if you have a print pattern, to go ahead and highlight before you start all of the numbers for your size throughout the pattern. And if you are working with a digital pattern, there are annotation apps that you can use to do this as well, to highlight all your numbers so you don't get mixed up. Then yarn, it's going to tell you the brand of the yarn and the yarn line. It may tell you the content of the yarn, hopefully, how much yarn is in a ball or a hank or a skein. Most importantly, how many of them you'll need. This is usually an estimate, but we do our best. And so in this case, I've listed the specific yarn that I used, which is manufactured by Harrisville Designs, and it is a line called Nightshades. And then these here are the names of the colors that I used. I've also listed approximately how much yarn you would need for each size in a sort of generic double knitting or DK weight or light worsted weight yarn, so that if you're not going to use the specified yarn, you have an idea of how much of an alternate yarn you might use. You won't always find this in patterns, particularly if a pattern is sponsored by a yarn company. It may only include the name of the actual yarn used, and then you'll have to do a little bit of research to maybe find an alternative yarn. Suggested needles, you'll see that it says suggested needles. This relates to this part here, so I'm going to get to that in a minute, but it's going to tell you the needle sizes you are most likely to need. And then notions, these are things other than yarn and needles that you will need to complete the pattern. So a yarn needle, that's pretty much on any pattern, you'll need that. Stitch markers, which are just little circles that you put on your knitting needles to mark off a certain number of stitches. And in this case, scrap yarn, which means some extra yarn. You might also find here buttons or a zipper or things like that. Now getting back to what this is. And a knitting, I don't want to get bogged down in the details here, but a knitting pattern is based on a certain number of stitches per inch in order to come out a certain size. So when you see gauge information, the designer of the pattern is telling you how many stitches per inch they got when they were knitting the sample. And then they're suggesting the size needles that you should use to hopefully get the same number of stitches per inch. So what you will do is create what is called a swatch, which is a small square of fabric. You'll cast on 20 stitches and knit those 20 stitches over 30 rows in whatever this fabric says. A lot of times, most of the time probably, it's going to be that stockinette stitch, but in this case it's a garter stitch cardigan. And you want this number of stitches in this number of rows to come out to be 4 inches. If it doesn't, then your sweater is not going to end up the same size, or your whatever it is you're knitting. Gauge is a bit of a complicated topic. I in fact have an entire e-course about it. So like I said, I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but I do want to say right from the get-go that gauge is very important, especially when you're talking about a garment that needs to fit you. And so it is important to check. And what will happen is if you don't get this gauge, so if you knit your 20 stitches in 32 rows and it's not 4 inches, you will change the size needle you use to try to get it to be 4 inches. So that's why it says suggested. All right, so that's the pattern information. That's the first element that should be in any knitting pattern somewhere. Next, those abbreviations. This is where I include them in my patterns. They may be somewhere else in another pattern you buy. So this is going to be a list of all the abbreviations that are used in the instructions. Eventually, you will already have most of these memorized, so it's just for reference, but you don't want to have to go looking things up while you're working with your pattern, all that information should be right there. And you already know a few of these: bind off, cast on, knit, and purl. Now, also in my abbreviations is where I include this information, and any pattern that you purchase should really have this, a way for you to contact the designer if you have questions. Now, by questions, I mean you think one of the numbers is wrong or some of the directions are unclear. It doesn't mean you contact the designer and ask how to do something that you don't know. The designer's not there to teach you. Unfortunately, the cost per download of knitting patterns doesn't include free lessons. But if you need clarity on some instructions or you think there's an error, you should be able to get in contact with the designer, and this is going to show you how. So somewhere in the pattern, it should say something like this. And then I also include a bit about social media. Designers love to see your projects that you've knit with their patterns. So if they've got hashtags, definitely use them. In addition to abbreviations, sometimes a pattern will have special techniques where the designer is giving more detail about how to do a special stitch pattern or something that perhaps the majority of knitters don't already know how to do. So they're not going to explain how to knit stitch and how to purl stitch, but they're going to explain something that's a little bit more involved. So in this case, there are two special techniques in this pattern, a Latvian braid and applied I-cord. So I've got a description of how to do them, and I've also included a link to a video tutorial. If this, of course, were a print pattern, then the link would be spelled out so you could go find it. And then lastly, the third element is, of course, the instructions. These are the most important parts so that you can knit whatever it is. You may find some notes at the beginning that are going to tell you information you need to know before you get started. Maybe not, it's not always essential. And then the instructions are usually going to be broken down by whatever part of the thing you are knitting is. So in this case, you're starting with the back of the sweater. In another case, you might be starting at the front or at the collar, or there are a lot of different ways you can build a sweater, and the instructions are probably going to be broken down so you know what it is you're working on and how it should look. And then I know, again, a lot of this information is going to be new to you, so don't try to get bogged down in all these words. But you can see right here, it's going to tell you how many stitches to cast on. And again, it's broken up by size. So this is the extra small, the small, and so on. Then it's going to tell you what stitch to work, how long to work it, and go through like that for pretty much any pattern, no matter what it is you're knitting. So it should tell you row by row instructions. If there are specific instructions that need to be repeated, you may see actual row numbers, row 1, 2, 3, 4. Different rows should be called out so that you know when you're changing to a different row. There'll be a lot of measurements telling you how long to knit something, so many inches from the armhole. And then you can see here again, now you're working on the left front. So everything is kept as concise as possible, but we also, of course, want it to be clear. So all these are the instructions for how to build your sweater. And then the last section right after the instructions is the finishing. In a lot of garments or accessories or whatever, it's basically just going to say something like this: weave in all your ends, wash and block to finished dimensions, which basically means wash whatever it is and lay it flat to dry, and spread it out so it's the right size. In this case, with a sweater, there's a little bit of extra work to be done: a hem, a front band's collar, things like that. And then lastly, any garment pattern should have this section. This is called a schematic. So as I said, the sizes are listed by the bust circumference, or if it were a men's garment, the chest circumference. But there are a whole lot of other measurements in here as well, and you want to make sure that not just the bust circumference of your sweater matches, but all of these measurements match. So any garment pattern should have a schematic telling you at least the bust or chest circumference, this part here, the armhole depth or yoke depth. So that is the distance from the top of the shoulder to the bottom of the armhole. They should all have that. If this comes out too big or too small, your sweater is very uncomfortable. And then the circumference of the sleeve. Again, a sweater whose sleeves are too tight is not going to be comfortable. Now, some of this other stuff, you can always make a sleeve longer, or you can always make the body of your sweater longer, or the exact width of the back neck of the sweater is maybe not super important. But at a minimum, you should have these measurements. In this case, my sweater does not have any what's called waist shaping, which means it's a straight line all the way down the body. A lot of sweaters will have waist shaping, so it comes, sort of in toward the waist and then out again. And in that case, it should also have a waist circumference and a hip circumference. But definitely you need this body circumference information, upper arm circumference for the sleeve, and this yoke depth. So that is pretty much everything you will find in a knitting pattern. In this case, this sweater had a bit of an odd construction, so I also included a diagram labeling how it was laid out, and which parts you were working when. That is not typical. You may see this also with a shawl if it has a unique construction, but generally speaking, you're not going to get this this part, but you should definitely have this part. All right, and so that's it. That is what a knitting pattern looks like. Those are the key elements of a knitting pattern. And so now you know what to look for. Okay, so now that you have a bit of an idea of how to read a knitting pattern, you might be wondering where to get a knitting pattern. And the good news is that they are available a number of ways. And if you are practicing your good social distancing right now, a lot of them are available online, so you don't even have to leave your house. The number one resource for knitting patterns, I definitely think, is Ravelry. Ravelry began as a database of knitting patterns back in 2007, but it has evolved over time as a platform where independent designers like myself can publish their patterns. So I don't have to depend on a third-party publisher to publish my pattern for me. I create my pattern, I create a PDF, I upload it to Ravelry, and I put it for sale in my shop. And then you can buy my pattern that way, pay via PayPal, and it's delivered to you via email, and it's also stored in a library directly on Ravelry. And then Ravelry has also expanded to be sort of a social media site for knitters and crocheters as well, weavers and spinners. So there are forums there where you can talk to other crafters. There's a very extensive pattern search where you can indicate what it is you're looking for in a pattern, and it will narrow it down for you. It also has had database of yarns, and also offers a library to actually store all of your patterns in. So as far as, bang for your buck, it's free. Patterns cost money, but the site itself is free to use. Number one, definitely Ravelry. It's been an amazing resource for fiber artists. So many thanks to Jess and Cassidy, who started and continue to maintain Ravelry. It is an amazing resource. So that is my number one recommendation. To find knitting patterns, go to Ravelry.com and just start looking. You can also find print knitting patterns in your local yarn shop. And in many cases, it's, again, independent designers who are wholesaling their patterns in print to the local yarn shop. So it might be the same patterns you can find on Ravelry, but you can buy, if you're a paper person, you want that physical copy of the pattern, you can buy it in your local yarn shop. And a lot of times now, designers are also including with those print patterns a download code so that you can download the digital copy on Ravelry as well. So you get both places covered. You can buy a knitting pattern book. There are many, many pattern books. You can buy them again at your local yarn shop, your independent bookstore, and of course also on Amazon and the other online retailers. Most knitting pattern books have some kind of theme. I recently received one as a gift that is the official Harry Potter knitting pattern book, so all kinds of Harry Potter themed knits. And there's kind of something for everybody, so that's another good resource. And then lastly, there are knitting magazines. And in the case of books and magazines, it's a lot of the same independent designers who are being published by a third party. So for example, I have 4 patterns being published by some knitting magazines in 2020. Most of the knitting magazines now are digital editions, so you can go through iTunes or whatever it's called now to subscribe. And then the editions are delivered electronically and automatically to you, and you have them right there on your iPad. So lots of places that you can get knitting patterns and start working on some great knitting projects. Of course, I'm going to encourage you to support your independent knitting pattern designers like myself and many other very, very talented people, and check out their patterns. So plenty of places to get your knitting patterns now that you're ready to start knitting. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me for Knitting 101. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope I have made some new knitters. We have a very vibrant knitting and crochet fiber arts community, very active on social media. So if you are on Instagram, you can look for some knitters over there. We're lots of us. Again, we are on Ravelry as well. Lots of discussions in the forums and forums for just about anything you might imagine you want to talk about. So I hope you will join our community, and I hope you will keep practicing your knitting. If there's been a good response to this, then I may try a Knitting 102 series a little bit further down the road. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye and happy knitting.